Hello and greetings. Thank you, Matt, and thank you everyone for coming tonight. I know that you could be listening to the Beatles in Beulah, but this is a better gig, I'm sure. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'm going to cover tonight. Tonight, I'm going to give a brief history of steam vessels, including the Great Lakes. I'm going to also talk about some early Frankfort history, both as a harbor and as a port town. I'm going to talk about early steamboats and steamers, as they're known, that were in Frankfort, how passenger steamer, the industry grew in the late 1800s, impact that passenger steamers have had on Frankfort, and the legacy of Great Lakes steamers in our area. So a couple of things I'm not going to cover. I'm not going to cover car ferries. Unfortunately, or fortunately, actually, it's been covered quite thoroughly in other lectures. So I'm going to skip over car ferries. I'm also going to skip over the railroad because it was primarily covered, or has been covered also extensively. And unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to get into detail on summer resorts. I had hoped to make that part of the lecture, but as it turns out, there's so much material about passenger steamers in this area that it will fill up an entire lecture. And I would be happy, or somebody would be happy, to give a lecture on summer resorts here in the future. So here we go. I have a lot to cover. I'm going to try to cover it as quickly and briefly as possible. If you can save your questions till the end, that would be awesome. Part one, early travel in the Great Lakes. So here we have the Claremont. The Claremont was a steamer, the very first steamer. It was the first steam vessel for commercial water transportation in the world. It was designed and built in 1818 by Robert Fulton and Robert Livingston. Now, it was also known as the North River steamer. And the reason is that the Hudson River used to be called the North River at one time. Here is a replica of the Claremont, and it was 150 feet long, 13 feet wide, and it only drew 2 feet of water. Top speed, 4 miles an hour. So this vessel is called the Walk in the Water. It was built in 1818, and it was the first steamer on the upper Great Lakes. The upper Great Lakes being Lake Erie, Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, Lake Superior. It was 132 feet long. It had a 32-foot beam and a draft of 6.5 feet, a single-cylinder 73 horsepower steam engine that was built in New York City. It was built in Buffalo, as I said, and according to legend, it got its name from a Wyandot Indian who thought it looked like it was walking on the water. The Walk in the Water made round trips to Detroit from Buffalo, with stops in Erie, Pennsylvania, and Cleveland, Ohio. In 1819, it traveled to Mackinac Island via Lake Huron, then on to Green Bay via Lake Michigan, bringing back furs for the American Fur Company. Hence, it was the very first steam vessel to travel into Lake Michigan. Unfortunately, in 1821, it was wrecked in a gale near Buffalo. So another important thing to note about the Great Lakes is the building of the Erie Canal. Erie Canal was built or completed in 1825. It was the nation's first superhighway. It was known as Clinton's Folly. It was 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep. And on this map, you can see it was 363 miles long. And at its peak in 1855, it carried 33,000 commercial shipments. It brought major growth to Albany, Syracuse, Rochester, and Buffalo. Buffalo grew from a population of 200 in 1820 to 18,000 in 1840. So many of you might be familiar with this map. This is called the Mitchell map from 1835. And what's interesting here is that although there was development and surveying and counties in southern Michigan, northern Michigan was still largely wilderness. In fact, if you look along the entire coast of Lake Michigan, you can see that it was still largely undeveloped in 1835. So all that changed after statehood, which was in 1837. And here in 1839, you can see that northern Michigan was finally surveyed. Now, if you look close, you can see that Crystal Lake at that time was called Cap Lake, which I'm assuming has something to do with whitecaps. The other thing of note here is that the Benzie River outlet was at Frankfort, and the sandbar and the natural inlet was on the north side of Benzie Lake. So what you're seeing there, and when you look closely at that sandbar, is you're looking at a feature that was very similar to almost every other port city or every other natural outlet along Lake Michigan. This was a big problem for boats. If you had a sandbar, that means it was shallow, and boats would not be able to go in on a natural sandbar, over a sandbar, unless it had been improved. So improvements. Next big improvement in the Great Lakes was the building of the Soo Locks in 1855. The Soo Locks were where the rapids of the St. Mary's River are, and it opened boats to be able to travel into Lake Superior. The first boat to pass was called the steamer Illinois, not to be confused with an Illinois steamer that we'll discuss later. So the opening of the Great Lakes led to rapid immigration and development. Here you have Milwaukee in 1856. Other cities like Milwaukee grew rapidly. Milwaukee by 1850 already had 20,000 people living there. And it was the same population basically as Chicago at that time. So here's Chicago. This is the Rush Street Bridge. This is a lithograph from 1860. As you know, Chicago grew very rapidly as a hub for rail and shipping. And in this, you can see the Comet, which was a brand new side-wheeler steamer that was built in Marine City, which is along the Port Huron River. And it was also built in 1860. So these cities grew fast. Here's a population chart for Chicago. 1840, less than 5,000 people lived there. By 1860, over 100,000 people lived there. And it doubled rapidly. It was almost exponential. By 1900, 1.7 million people lived in Chicago. So that's an indicator of the kind of population that we saw around the Great Lakes, obviously different scale, but it largely was due to transportation and opportunities for shipping. So now we're going to move on. We're going to talk a little bit about early Frankfort. Some have seen this map. This is the 1860 map of this area. Note that they call Frankfort the Frankfort Colony lands, and down closer to Benzonia, you have the Ohio Colony lands. The only road that I've been able to see in this map is one over here, which says something about going to Traverse Bay on a diagonal on the lower right. Otherwise, the county was pretty sparse. Here's a close-up from that map. It shows Frankfort on the lake. And in this etching, you can see there were a few buildings already in Frankfort in 1860. There was some kind of mill, which you can see where the smoke is coming out. And then you can see a sailing vessel and a steam vessel. So there was already steam travel to Frankfort, to this area by 1860. This is the title from that map, and I think it's just interesting to note that Frankfort was known as a harbor and a town, and it was part of Leelanau County at the time. The first steamboat that we have photographs of that came to Frankfort was the J. Barber. And in the notes below, it says, first passenger boat running along the shore between Chicago and Frankfort in 1869. Here's a second photo of the J. Barber. This is located inside the harbor of on Benzie Lake. And you see the trees in the background where later the hotel was located. And you might also note all the lumber that's piled up on the dock. Lumber was obviously the first industry, and lumber also supplied fuel for steamboats. Here's a close-up of the J. Barber. Again, it was built in 1856. It was a propeller-driven steamboat. So former steamboats had mostly been side wheelers. Propellers became much more popular and dominant at this point forward. You might also note, if you look real closely, there's a set of antlers, look like elk antlers right up there on the top of the pilot house. That might have been good luck, who knows? The first hotel to be built in Frankfort was the Delbridge House. Here's a photograph from 1870. It was established in 1867 by J.B. Delbridge as the first hotel. It was located near the beach across from Cannon Park. It was renamed the Park Hotel in 1871. There was a second hotel about the same time. This is called the Frankfort House, which is on the far right, the white building, and it was established in 1868. Later, it became known as the National Hotel on the same location. Later, it was the Père Marquette, the Yeasel, the Pack Inn, and today it's the Hotel Frankfort in the same location. And in the back, you can see the Park Hotel. This is a view of Frankfort in 1870. We have the Butler Sawmill on the left, and in the background, across the bay, you can see the Frankfort Ironworks. Now, at this time, most travel in the Great Lakes was still by schooner. I'm sorry. This is the Frankfort Ironworks. So the Frankfort Ironworks was established in 1869. This is in what is today Alberta. And on the left, men are standing on top of charcoal kilns, which were used to create charcoal to fuel the furnace. Below, you see a lot of logs. It said that the kilns or the furnace consumed 100 cords of wood a day. And it was a major employer, not just for the men working at the furnace, but also for the farmers who in the winter would shift over to cutting trees and bringing logs for both the furnace and then also for the lumber trade. So here's a very early ad from Benzie for the Engelman Transportation Company. This is their new popular swift and elegant side wheel steamers. This line, the first that called on Frankfort with advertising at least, carried daily ships from Frankfort down to Grand Haven. It was stops at Manistee, Ludington, Pentwater, Stony Creek, Montague, Whitehall, and Muskegon. From there, it had connections at Grand Haven to get to either Chicago or Milwaukee. So there were two ships that are being shown here. One is called the Metropolis. The other is the City of Toledo. The City of Toledo, interestingly, was a steamship that was converted back into being a schooner. And the Metropolis is shown here. So this was a side wheel steamer, and it had an interesting design. It was called an archtop side wheel steamer. And you can see the arch, which was for structural purposes. This design was fairly popular for a while, and then it faded out, and they figured out ways to make ships without it. The Metropolis was made of wood, same as most steamers at the time. It was 168 feet long, 26 feet wide, and it had a depth of 19 feet. Now here's the Metropolis at a different port, and this is at a later time. This here at this time, it was in probably Lake Huron, and on the side it says Alpena, Saginaw, and Bay City. It burned in Toledo in 1902. There were a number of drawbacks to side wheel steamers. One of the reasons that it faded out and propeller ships took over was that when you had rough water, then often only one of the paddles was in the water at a time. So the ships lost a lot of efficiency when the water was rough. So now we're going to go to Frankfort back here in the 1880s and cover a few things. Here's a view of the waterfront in 1885. This picture was taken from the South Frankfort side. You can see the Butler sawmill on the right-hand side, and you can see large piles of lumber, both on the right and in the middle and on the left. So lumber was king. And if I show you a close-up, you can now see that there are two boats in this picture. On the left is a schooner, and on the right is a steamer. And this was a type of steamer called a lumber hooker. And they called it that because it was designed mostly like a freighter, and they could pick up and use winches to put the lumber on the deck. Something of note here, if you look very closely, you can see that both ships are about the same size. In fact, a lot of early steamers had been schooners at one time, so they could take the hull and configure it and put a steam motor in it. Park Hotel continued to thrive. Here it is, 1885, big addition. And I think that's a big snow pile in the front, but I can't tell you for sure. Around this time, we have the earliest of what are called Sanborn maps. This guy, excuse me, Sanborn, Daniel Sanborn, he invented this company or started this company in Boston in 1866. And what they did is they specialized in fire insurance maps. So they took very close detail of each building inside a town or area and managed to provide details for fire insurance. Now, if you look close up, you'll see that there was some details about Frankfort. So here in 1885, he's saying that there was 2,600 people, 1,800 in Frankfort, 800 in South Frankfort. Prevailing winds, east and west. Water facilities, not good. No steam or hand engines, no hose cart, one hook and ladder truck, grades about level. In the index, which is hard to see from here, from where you are, on the right-hand side is a list of specials or businesses. And if we look real close, almost everything at that time had to do with wood. There were sawmills, lathe mills, there were shingle mills, there was a planing mill. So it was wood, 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 except for there was a flour mill, the furnace, which we saw pictures of, church or two, and a livery, and most interestingly, a roller rink. Not sure where that was. Here's a close-up from one of these maps, and you can see on the left is the Park Hotel, and over on the right, the Frankfort Hotel. This is a close-up of the ironworks. You can see the charcoal kilns on the center and right, and the actual furnace on the left. Unfortunately, in 1885, it already is noted as closed. The Ann Arbor Railroad reached Frankfort, South Frankfort in 1887. Major development for the area. This is a great shot of the train as it's leaving. And another addition in Frankfort was the mineral well. And this was put in, interestingly, for the purpose of looking for salt deposits. The reason that they were looking for salt deposits is that there was success in Manistee, where salt had been found using wells, and a big industry had sprung up of being able to ship salt out of Manistee. Unfortunately, no salt was found in Frankfort. There were a couple other boats in Frankfort at the time, smaller ones. This is a steamer called the Potawatomi, which was owned by a gentleman named George Waters. And he was successful. He actually had a second steamer, and this is his steamer, the Cynthia, which was built by him in 1876. So these ships, they were early. The big change really occurred when the Seymour Company out of Manistee came to town. The Seymour family, which was three brothers, they had originated in Montreal, believe it or not, and they came to Milwaukee, had started several businesses. In 1881, they started the Northern Michigan line and started advertising for ships that they could offer passenger traffic to places like Charlevoix, Petoskey, Harbor Springs, Mackinac. The first ship they bought was called the Champlain, which is shown here. The Champlain was purchased from D.H. Day when D.H. Day was in Grand Haven. It was propeller driven, 135 feet long, 26 feet wide, a depth of 11.5 feet. They also purchased a boat called the Lawrence, and purchased in 1882. It had been built in 1868. It's also a wooden propeller steamer, very similar to the Champlain. I'm interested in how and why all the passengers are standing on the top of the boat. Later, the Lawrence was renamed the Frontenac in 1902. Here's a winter shot of Frankfort in showing the Lawrence, I'm sorry, is here in the foreground, just past the shed at the railroad yard. In the distance, through the mast, you can see the Park Hotel, and also in the distance, you can see the hill that was later taken down for the Royal Frontenac. Unfortunately, the Champlain caught fire. In 1887, it burned at Fisherman's Island near Harbor Springs. Burned pretty much just down to the hull. You can see the stack from the steam engine. Here's another shot of the same, the Champlain. I like this photo because, as you can see on the far right, a steam fire engine. So there's the smoke coming from the boiler, and you can see the intake hose hanging over into the water. This was a steam engine that was on wheels, so they must have had to wheel it onto this tug and then use it to try to put out the fire. So what did the Seymours do? They rebuilt it. They rebuilt it and renamed it. Here it is. Now it's called the City of Charlevoix in 1888. And this photo is taken in Charlevoix. Second shot of this boat. Here it is in Charlevoix, leaving the harbor. It's a great photo. It shows a lot of activity on the wharfs, and it shows interesting water well with a storage system. So they went and decided to build their own boat. This is the Petoskey in 1887. It was built in Manitowoc for the Seymours. So now they had a boat of their own that they had built from the beginning. In this ad for the Petoskey, it says, a staunch and excellent boat for the trade engaged in. In some of the fine print, it says, boasting mahogany finished staterooms, capacity 210, speed 13 miles an hour. It was 171 feet long, had a 30-foot beam, and 12 feet depth. Here's the Petoskey in Frankfort in 1889. You can see the warehouse on the left for the ship, for the company. You can also see some smokestacks behind the Petoskey, and those would be from sawmills. So they added another ship, another boat called the Puritan. In 1887, this boat was built. It was added to their line. This is a picture taken in Charlevoix. It was the first Puritan. So for those who may know something about steamers, there was a later Puritan. This is the first version. This was the wooden version. It was built in Benton Harbor for the Graham and Morton Company. Unfortunately, it burned in Manistee in 1895. So in the 1890s, there were a whole lot of innovations going on, both in Frankfort and elsewhere. Back to the Sanborn maps, some of the pictures, some of the highlighted areas are then blown up on the maps. In the index, we see that there are now 4 hotels in Frankfort, and there were a number of other things, including an opera house, excuse me. Then in 1892, big changes. The inlet was changed in Frankfort and moved, and the breakwater was built. It coincides with the new Ann Arbor car ferries, which also came in 1892. So this shows the routes of some of the car ferries from the Ann Arbor. The car ferries mostly went to either Manitowoc or to ports north of Manitowoc. This is a photo from a mural that's on the wall of our museum. And I'm showing it here because it just kind of shows how the passenger ferries really didn't compete with the same locations as the car ferries, which were focused on ore and trains. However, the Pere Marquette Railroad was more active in the area. And in this picture is an ad. You can see that they were also owned and associated with the salt industry. They did represent competition for the Seymours, although they were primarily focused on their railroad business and for the routes from Ludington, where the trains had their terminals. A local steamer at that time was the John D. Dewar, which was built in 1885. It was called a short haul steamer, and just ran between Frankfort and Manistee, mostly in the 1890s. You can see it's a smaller vessel. Here's another shot of the John D. Dewar in Frankfort. So big changes were occurring in the business. Ships were getting bigger. There was a new company in Chicago called the Manitou Steamship Company. This was the first generation of steel-hulled steamers. It's also amongst the first to be passenger-only steamers. 275 feet long, 42 feet wide, 20-foot depth. It's a very large boat by comparison to what they'd seen before. And on that same scale here is the Northland, which had also been built in that time. It was built in 1895. It was 358 feet long. It was another passenger-only design. It had 3 stacks that were later reduced to 2 stacks in 1902. An interesting fact about the Northland is that in World War I, in 1918, it was cut in half to transit the Welland Canal, and it was never rejoined and cut up for scrap in 1921. Now, the Seymours, they knew that change was coming, so they decided, hey, we got to build a boat of our own. And this is their first large passenger vessel, the Illinois. And the Illinois was built, I said 1899. It was steel hull, 225 feet long, 40-foot beam, 25-foot depth. And like their other boats, this was a dual purpose freight and passenger boat. So you can see all the openings to load freight on the lower level. And then you can see there are 2 passenger decks on the Illinois. So now we're getting to the golden era of passenger steamers, the 1900s. The city of Charlevoix, here is shown in Frankfort, continued to be in operation. One of the Seymours, they now were called the Northern Michigan Transportation Company. And they still operated the city of Charlevoix, the Petoskey, and then their new boat, the Illinois. The city of Charlevoix, however, was renamed in 1904 the Kansas. And it was also refitted so that it was better for passengers. They also built another ship in 1904. This is the new steamer, the Missouri. The Missouri was similar in size to the Illinois, but as you can see, instead of 2 exposed passenger decks, there was only 1 exposed passenger deck, and the second deck below it has porthole. So those portholes and that design may have been to make the ship more seaworthy in storms. So why the Missouri? Why the Illinois? Why the Kansas? These all are Midwestern states. I think that the answer is in the marketing. In this brochure, which is the Chicago and Alton Railroad brochure advertising summer trips, you can see their route for the railroad was to pick up people in places like St. Louis and Kansas City and other stops in Illinois and bring them to Chicago. Here's a close-up so you can see all those stops that this train had made or would be making. And then, of course, from Chicago, the idea was to get on some kind of a steamer and head north. So in 1904, there's a map here showing Frankfort, and Frankfort was certainly impacted by all of this. First thing you might notice is that there is now a dock, and it's on the map where the Northern Michigan Transportation Company had its pier. Better seen in this close-up. So here's the Northern Michigan Transportation Company slip, There's their warehouse. You can also see for the first time the Royal Frontenac Hotel, which had been built in 1902. Here is the Royal Frontenac. It was in existence for only 10 years, 1902 to 1912, when it burned to the ground, unfortunately. Here's a picture of the Manitou with the Royal Frontenac. Gives you an idea of the scale of the Manitou. Certainly larger than anything that the Seymours had, and it was clearly major competition. Here's a second photo that shows the Manitou and the Frontenac. So the Manitou Steamship Company, they had an interesting marketing strategy. They specialized in getting people north fast. The ship was known as the Greyhound of the Lakes because it was a very quick trip. On this marketing brochure from 1906, it shows that the business and professional man can take a weekend at Northern Lake Resorts, leaving Chicago at 6:30 p.m. on Fridays, and be back in Chicago at 8:30 on Monday morning. That's an interesting marketing value proposition. I'm not sure I would do it, but then he did. And they advertised everything else about the ship. It was all about summer vacations, health, rest, recreation, all kinds of detail. There's a woman actually swinging a golf club in that drawing. And in this drawing, they're singing the charms of charming Frankfort, bewitching Crystal Lake, beautiful Charlevoix. And if you want to read any of the detail, it tells you all kinds of interesting things about why you want to come up here. Here's a close-up of the main saloon in the Manitou. I'm sure that's mostly mahogany. And here's the dining saloon, which looks a little bit like the deck of the Starship Enterprise. The cabin plan for the Manitou was really extensive. So there was 2 levels with staterooms and berths. And on the main, on the second tier, you can see the berths were even doubled up. So there was inside and outside rooms that you could take. It costs, for Chicago to Frankfort, it cost $5 one way and $9 for a round trip. And again, you had to pay for a berth or stateroom. Inside rooms basically were about $1, and lower berth, it would be a little more expensive than an upper berth. So the Northland, when it came to town, it was quite something. The Northland here in this photo is probably the only picture I've ever seen where the Royal Frontenac doesn't look that big. The ship was, I mentioned earlier, 358 feet long. So it was really something. And here now you see it with only 2 stacks instead of 3. The Northland was connected with its own ship line out of Chicago. And here's another picture of the Northland with the Royal Frontenac in the back. It probably stopped coming to Frankfort after the Frontenac burned, but I don't know for sure. So the Seymours, they had to respond. They have this brochure from 1908. And again, they are advertising summer tours on the Great Lakes. And the second thing they did that was important is they bought the Manitou. So now the Manitou is owned by the Seymours and the Northern Michigan Transportation Company. In their brochure, they talk again about the great things that you're going to find when you come to Northern Michigan. Their schedule was a very interesting one. They stopped having the Manitou stop anywhere except directly from Chicago to Charlevoix. So it was an express ship and no more stops in Frankfort. However, the Missouri on the left made a lot of stops along the shore, and the Illinois as well, which is featured on the right. Again, these ships would come mostly to Ludington and then make stops along the way. Sometimes there were shortcuts, and they would come directly to places like Frankfort to start their stops along the way. This map kind of shows how the Northern Michigan Transportation Company developed. It concentrated on these routes with all of the ships throughout all its years of operation. It primarily stopped here, Ludington and points north. The Goodrich Company was a competitor out of Chicago, and the Goodrich Company had a very different marketing strategy. They concentrated on lines that would be in the southern eastern shore of Lake Michigan. So from Muskegon south, Benton Harbor, South Haven, Holland, Grand Haven. And then when they would go north, they would go to Milwaukee, Manitowoc, up through Green Bay, and then on to Mackinac Island as well. So there was very little overlap between these two companies. How they worked that out, I don't know. The rates were very similar to what we saw. Here's a rate sheet, and it tells about the costs of being able to come up. I think at that time, Frankfort one way, $4 from Chicago, and a round trip, $7.50. The cabin plan, we already saw the Manitou. This is what the cabin plan would have looked like for the Missouri. Much less in terms of cabins and luxury, but again, it was a dual purpose boat. And if you look at the Illinois, very similar, mostly just the two decks with the cabins on the outside and the dining and other areas for common use in the center. So they had a hotel list on their 1908 brochure. And here you can see that they were getting people to come up for hotels like the Frontenac, $2 to $4. The Park in Pierre Marquette Hotel, $1.50 to $2. And then they also list a new hotel, or a new inn called the Three Pines Inn, which was in Crystalia and had been built in 1899, and they charged $2. So now we get into some changing times for the industry and for Frankfort. Here's what Crystal Lake, map of Crystal Lake at the time. This is from 1909. It's called the Haswell map. And you can see all the new development of resorts around the lake. And you can see resorts also opening up on Platte Lake. Platte Lake Resort, UConn, Glenwood Park, which was the Windermere, Juanita Park, Glen Mollier, Oberlin, Crystalia, Congregational Summer Assembly, Poutz's Resort, which had been eventually was the first resort on Crystal Lake, and the Ottawa Resort, which was also an early resort. In Frankfort, also big changes were occurring. We took a closer look at the businesses there at the time. So now they do have a waterworks and a fire department. And there also is the county normal school. They've got more mills and wood product companies. There's a fish house now identified. There's the high school. And you see the Northern Michigan Transportation Company has a freight house, and the Pere Marquette Line Steamers freight house. Public school in Alberta. Let's take a closer look. Here is a close-up showing the Pere Marquette here in Frankfort here, and then the Northern Michigan Transportation Company here sharing this slip. You can also see the flour mill, which was basically behind the bank, and a couple of fish houses. Here's a picture of one of the Pere Marquette vessels. This is the Père Marquette number 6, and very similar in terms of size and capability as the Northern Michigan Transportation Company. This is one of my family's photos. This is a page from a photo album that was put together by Herbert Wolf in 1913. This is the family at the top getting ready to board the Illinois, which you can see at the lower left. And then here's a dock view viewed as we left. And here's a close-up of the dock. So here you can see the Northern Michigan Transportation Pier. A lot of people there, all pretty fancily dressed for middle of summer. And in the background is the flour mill. On the right, you can see the livery, the bank above it. And then on the far right, you can see the nets from the fish houses. Here's another view of the Missouri with the Northern Michigan Freight House. One of the things you notice in this photo is there are automobiles. This is a nice picture of the Missouri and the Illinois. And I like this one because you can very easily tell the two, the Missouri being the one with only one exposed cabin, promenade, as it would be called. And then over here on the right, you have the Illinois with the 2 open decks. Now, in this photo, you see 2 steamers as well. The one on the left, you'll see, is called the Puritan, which is interesting because the Puritan in this photo was a ship that was purchased by the Northern Michigan Transportation Company from a company in Chicago called the Graham and Morton Line. And this ship had been built in 1901. It was operated by the Northern Michigan Transportation Company, which had been renamed later the Michigan Transit Company. And it ran from 1923 to 1933. Here's a photo of the Puritan in the bay with a car ferry in the background. Now, the Puritan was converted to a troop transport also in World War I and reconverted to be a passenger vessel in 1918 and 1920. So here it is in dry dock in Manitowoc being rebuilt to be a passenger steamer again. Unfortunately, it was sold to a company called the Isle Royal Transportation Company, renamed the George M. Cox, and on its first years of service, it sank near Isle Royal. It struck a reef at the Rock of Ages in Lake Superior. No lives were lost. So what's the legacy of steamers? Let's talk first about the impact on Benzie County. In this 1915 resort map, it's kind of hard to see, but almost every resort could now be reached by a road. Formerly, that was not the case. And the tourism marketing of Benzie changed and began to focus more on automobiles. So here's their centerfold of the 1920s brochure. You can see it's showing Benzie with a circle around it and then all the Michigan roads. One thing I noted when I looked at this is that M115 had not been built. So if you were in Cadillac and you're heading for Benzie, you had to take a pretty circuitous route. And automobiles, even though they were available, they weren't great for long distance travel. So there was still reasons to want to take a steamer. Here's a steamer that still made calls at Frankfort for many years. This is called the South American. the Michigan Transit Company ended operations in the 1930s. And here's one of the ships that held on. And the South American remained in service until 1974. Interesting story. This is a watercolor that hangs at the museum. This is the South American. It's significant because the Benzonia High School class of 1951 took the South American to Niagara Falls. And this is a watercolor by Mary Cossins Dabrowski. There was also a sister ship called the North American, and this is a photograph of the North American in Frankfort. These ships were owned by the Chicago, Duluth, and Georgian Bay Transit Company. This ship was 280 feet long and retired in 1964. So the legacy lives on. We've got the SS Badger. This was originally a car ferry. It was converted to a passenger and automobile ferry in 1953. Still operates every summer from Ludington to Manitowoc, and it's a National Historic Landmark. We also have the SS City of Milwaukee, which is a floating museum in Manistee. Includes many features that are found in the passenger steamers that we have already talked about. And it's a hotel. You can actually stay on the SS City of Milwaukee in staterooms and relive history. There's also the Michigan Maritime Museum down in South Haven, celebrating their 50th year. They actually have an exhibit this year called The Golden Age of Steamers. So I want to thank you and thank everyone for being here. Special thanks I want to give to Mark Sprang, who's the archivist at Bowling Green State University Historical Collections of the Great Lakes, provided many of the photographs that you've seen this evening. I also want to thank Matt Barnum, Tim Foster, Grant Brown, Andy Bollender, Sherry Dundon, Mary Link, Jane Perkis, Steve Veach, Mary Ann Fleetwood, Carol Beidler, Deb Horner, and Irene and Paul Markison. And that's auspicious. My lovely wife, Carol, and all the volunteers at the museum. Paul, you want to bring up some lights and we can see if there are any questions. This photo is one of my family photos too, with the last view of Frankfort from the steamer from probably the 19-teens.
That's cool. I have a question about when they decommissioned ships, did they end up sinking them in the Great Lakes or
No, most were scrapped. They took them apart and used the metal. Ned.
One of the things that struck me as I watched this, having read my grandfather's diary, as you also have, regarding how they managed to take the steamer from Chicago to Frankfort without getting a stateroom, when there were something like 6 and 8 adults and 10 children and things like that. And I think it's one of the reasons the Missouri and the Illinois didn't have many staterooms, is that you could get a deck chair in which you could sleep all night. And you'd get on the steamer in Chicago and get your deck chair, your blankets, and get your sort of little family camp worked out on the deck there. And they'd wake you up in time in the morning to get off into Frankfort.
Well, he was also living on a minister's salary, so part of the challenge. And 5 to 6 children, depending on when they came.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ned. Jerry.
What were all those hanging, looked like swim noodles hanging down the sides of all the boat. Were those just bumpers for the docks?
Yeah, they were fenders. So they
Fenders.
would, instead of bringing them inside, they were big
Oh.
logs essentially.
And the Northland, was that sister ship to the infamous Eastland?
I don't think it was the same company.
No.
Because the Northland had a space between North and Land, and the
Wow.
Eastland was one word. So that's the only clue I have. And then for those that
Yeah.
don't know, the Eastland was the ship that tipped over in the Chicago River with 500 plus people who perished. And it happened during a party when everybody went to look over the side of the ship.
I was wondering about the fuel. I mean, it started with wood, but then, you know what stages or what?
I don't have the
Years.
years. I did try to do some research on that, but they moved to coal and then ultimately fuel oil. But coal was better, more efficient than wood. And the wood started to disappear. And, you know, they're more expensive. So wood became more valuable as building material. And so the scraps from the mills, there wasn't enough to be able to keep ships fully fueled. So they moved on to charcoal, which could be imported. Coal, I'm sorry, not charcoal. Go ahead.
Thanks, Larry. Did these steamship companies employ Benzie folks?
Well, there was an agent in Frankfort and there were clearly dock hands. What I don't know is if there were many that lived aboard and traveled with the boat. These were freight haulers as well as passenger steamers. And there, no doubt there was an active work being done to move materials to the docks, onto the boats. So it was probably a lot of local employment that really didn't mean they were on the boat, but they were supplying the boat.
I had a question about the harbor. Besides dealing with the sandbar that you showed us in one of the first maps, did anything else have to be done to accommodate these big vessels?
Well, I'm sure there was dredging. There's a great history of the Ludke Engineering Company out of Frankfurt. They started in the early 1930s, and they were the first engineering company on the Great Lakes to use sheet piling to create piers and dock improvements. They also did a lot of dredging and built ships, or vessels just designed specifically for dredging, and had contracts eventually all around the Great Lakes. But someday we'll hope to give a talk on the Ludke company because it's a remarkable history.
Larry, how long was the trip from Chicago to here? And do you have any personal information about your family on what it was like to travel on the boat?
Well, Ned, who's my uncle, mentioned my great-grandfather, his grandfather's diaries, which we have, and he would write every day about everything. And when they were traveling, he wrote about being aboard the city of Charlevoix that first summer. And the memory I have is that he was very appreciative of the service that they gave. He had a family, his brother and his wife and their children were with them. So it was a large group. And between them, I think they had something like 15 bags or trunks plus bundles of tent poles. And they came and they actually camped at Bay Point, which is now Railroad Point, and took the railroad there from Frankfurt. But the ships were, he described the first voyage as a fine sail. And I think if you had good weather, it was easy. It was overnight. So they usually would board late in the evening and be to Manistee, usually the first stop, and then to Frankfurt maybe by late morning the next day. So not too bad. George. When were the first Well, you saw the inlet in 1892. So that was really the first modern improvement. And there was a lighthouse built out on the end of the pier. And it was mostly logs and stone at that time. They weren't using sheet piling until 1930s. Yeah. Yeah, the design and the design, and it was rebuilt later, but the 1892, they were parallel. And they created a channel that was next to where the Royal Frontenac was. Yes, Charlie.
Larry,
Hi.
hey, really informative talk. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm curious about the relative, profitability of these businesses. Did you learn about like what these ships cost? And, I was struck by, the affordability of the fares. And, I'm just wondering, in relative terms, did you get some insight into how these, travel and ship, companies are? Obviously freight was a big part of their.
What I don't have is actual numbers, but I do know that the Seymours, they were a smaller operator compared to some of the bigger ones in Chicago. And they must have been turning a profit in order to continue to build ships. So they built the Petoskey, then they built the Illinois, and then they built the Missouri. And that obviously, was expensive to build. Freight became, I think, really an important part of their strategy. But when the lumber kind of started to dry up, I think then it was agriculture and getting things to market in Chicago. And I forget who told me this, but somebody told me a story about how they could deliver fresh fish to Chicago that had been caught up here and that could be turned around quickly and put to market next day in Chicago. So that helped economically. But in the end, the Depression kind of hurt them. I noticed in one article it said that they stopped paying their dock fees in the 20s. So that might have been the beginning of the end. Sure.
How many people took the rail, like got off at Frankfort and maybe took the Ann Arbor up to Petoskey? Was that faster or slower?
I think once you're on the boat, the economics of it it was like an extra $1 to go all the way to Charlevoix. So if you're going to spend $4 to get here and for another $1, go to Charlevoix or Mackinac,
Just stay on.
it was the thing to do. Yeah. No, I don't think people got off because you also had to make changes. The Ann Arbor was going south and you'd have to make a change in Thompsonville, get on the Pere Marquette. I don't know how many other railroads before you could be up all the way to the Straits. I think that the market was a different market too from Detroit because they were heavily advertising the Ann Arbor Railroad as a way to get to Benzie. So it was probably more likely to come, if you're from that area of the state, you're much more likely to have come here on the train. And if you're in Chicago, it was still easier and cheaper probably to get here by boat. Yes, exactly. Well, if no, thank you very much, everyone.
All right. Well, thank you, Larry, for presenting with us here this evening. And thank you to all of you for joining us. Our next lecture is going on the road next month. It'll be actually at the Garden Theater, 6 o'clock on Thursday, September 12th, as Jay Peregrine and Tim Foster present Frankfort Rotary 100 Years.